Welcome everyone to the ITRC training program on building community-based mental wellness and resilience. There's the first slide. I welcome you to today's session by Dr. Judith Landau on using the link approach to mobilize community members to enhance resilience. This is a very, very interesting session, I think. And before we get started, as before, I want to just thank all of our co-sponsors, especially the American Public Health Association for offering the CE credits, and Keisha Lindor and the Trauma Resource Institute for handling the logistical aspects of this program. Let's start again like we have in the past with a brief resilience pause. So far, we've practiced somatic or body-based presencing skills, tracking and grounding, and I think we talked a little bit about help now. We've also practiced some breath-based presencing skills, controlled breathing, and 6-second breathing. I now want to share another important sort of related breath-based skill called mindful breathing. And it's similar to 6-second breathing and controlled breathing, but really has a sort of a different focus. So if you will, just take a moment to calm yourself, go inward if you want. You can do this with your eyes open. You can do this with your eyes closed. You can do this standing or sitting. The best way to do mindful breathing or the most effective often is to sit or lie down. And the purpose is to just watch yourself breathing. Just watch the breath come into your body, fill your lungs and abdomen, and leave your body, leave your lungs and abdomen. And there's no right way to do it. There's no judgment about right or wrong. You're not trying to change anything. Just become mindful that you are breathing. So let's just take a second or so and do that and just take some mindful breaths. And then when you're willing, you can just come back to the session. The research shows that if you practice mindful breathing from 3 to 15 minutes a day for a number of weeks, you will find that you are much calmer and much more able to deal with stressful situations. You might want to practice that. We'll continue to practice it a little more as we go forward. Just a summary again of the flow of what we've done with the training program. We started the opening panel with some of the presenters, including Dr. Landau here, who will join us with an overview of what you're going to learn during the session. The first session then introduced presencing and purposing skills, or what we call self-regulation and adversity-based growth skills. This next session focused on, with Laura Porter, how to organize and facilitate and staff a Resilience Coordinating Council. We then moved on to focusing on how to become aware of and manage our racial and cultural biases within a Resilience Coordinating Council and when we're working with others to create a sense of us rather than otherness. Last session with Sandy Bloom talked about how to build safety and trust within a Resilience Coordinating Council. And all of the remaining sessions will now focus on how to build resilience in the communities. For the first 4 sessions, they're really focused on how to facilitate and operate a Resilience Coordinating Council to build resilience in the community. Now we're going to start focusing on how to actually engage in those activities. And again, as I said, we're going to focus on using the link approach, as Dr. Landau will explain in a second. Before we hear from her, let me just provide a background in terms of what do we mean by community. What we typically mean is a group of people that share the same geographic area and more or less the same environment. And when people in this kind of community, they basically often share the same needs and desires but they also typically hold different values, different norms, different belief systems. So there are different cultures, so to speak, within existing communities, different languages, slangs, customs, habits, religions, spiritual beliefs, arts, way of relating to each other, and ways of relating to the natural environment. And communities can be urban and suburban or rural. They can be indigenous, First Nations, or non-native, or variations of these. And increasingly, as this training program shows, a community can be a group of people with a common purpose who join together in a virtual space through an online communication platform. The people in these kinds of virtual communities like ours also have different norms and values and cultural identities, but it's much harder to connect with that because we don't get to interact with each other as much, and it's not personal. So with that as a background, thinking about the different communities, let's practice one other resilience pause. Let's practice one other presencing skill and take one brief resilience pause and focus on thinking distortions. So let's first practice mindful breathing for just a second. Just watch yourself breathing. Notice the breath coming in your body, entering your body, leaving your body without trying to change anything, without any judgments. There's no right or wrong way to breathe. And then as you continue mindful breathing, just try to notice when you are distressed, whether you're practicing a thinking distortion. For example, might you be catastrophizing? This is the worst thing that could ever happen to me. Or do you tend to blame someone or something? Or are you fixated on flaws, things that are wrong? Are you personalizing what has happened? This is all due to me, or I'm responsible for what's happening. Are you making big assumptions that you really can't know? Are you using should or ought statements? I should, I ought, or they should, they ought. Are you using all or nothing thinking? It's either this way or no way. There are about 10 different common thinking distortions that can really cause us to stay outside or be pushed outside of a resilient zone into a high or low zone. And it's very helpful to sort of observe when you might be practicing a thinking distortions, because we all do it. While you practice mindful breathing, because it helps you just accept that that's happening and then go back to the breath. At the end of the slides show my slide presentation today. There's a whole section on thinking distortions that you can look at after the session, including a method you can use to how to practice, how to look at thinking distortions. So those are two different presencing skills that we practiced today. And now going back to the focus on communities, building community resilience requires what we call multi-systemic approaches, which means you have to simultaneously address many different levels of a community. And two of the very most important are the individual and the family level. And that is what Dr. Landau is going to talk about today. You've met her before in the first opening panel, but Dr. Landau is president and CEO of Linking Human Systems. She's a child, family, and community psychiatrist, and former professor who helps individuals, families, and communities really across the world access resilience to overcome major disasters and trauma. She's taught in over 100 countries and consulted with the UN, the World Health Organization, and many other governments. And it's my honor now to introduce and allow Judith to take over. Judith, it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much. am thoroughly enjoying this whole series and very honored to be participating in it. So thank you. So we're going to talk about the LINK model, which is really based on enhancing community resilience. And as Bob said, we'll talk about individuals and families as a component of the community. So what I'm going to do with you today is we're going to do an overview of the method, learn some of the exercises and tools as they're used through the process, and I'll illustrate it with real examples. And while we're working, I'd like you to be thinking about your own community and what's happening in that. Don't worry about writing things down, or that I won't cover everything that is actually on the slides, because Bob and Keisha have done an incredible job of providing the slides and all the materials and methods and tools to you at the end of the session. So just relax, you'll have it all. I wanted to give you a complete picture so that you've got all the resources and references when you need them later. So just a little bit of background about how this model developed. I grew up before and during the horrors of apartheid in a group fighting systemic racism and traveling with a father who died building health and community prevention centers in all the cross-cultural persecuted communities. My stable support system was rooted in community, not place. I was the oldest of 34 non-blood siblings, and we all relied on one another and each other's parents in the absence of our own when somebody was on a banning order or imprisoned or escaped to a different country. So this model was really forged in trauma and community support. Unfortunately, there's a lot of trauma right now. In certain regions of South Africa, when someone does something wrong, he's taken to the center of the village, surrounded by the tribe, and all they do is talk about all the good he's done in his lifetime. Because if he did something wrong, it was a mistake. It was a cry for help. And this ritual helps the person reconnect with his true nature, which is inherently good and resilient. And the belief is that unity and affirmation have far more power to bring about change than shame and punishment. And this is known as Ubuntu, humanity towards others. I am because we are. Without you, I am not a whole person. So let's get into LINK community resilience. And this is used when a community is facing major or multiple challenges to help them access that inherent resilience. We provide the process. We let the community generate content and goals related directly to what they want to achieve, not ours. Then we help them turn those goals into realistic tasks and practical projects, building on all their existing resources. The less we do as professionals, the more successful the program and the community. We tread lightly, leaving no footprints, while the community takes all credit for change. So Bob mentioned one of the definitions of community, and there are a number, so I'd like to share our definition of community resilience. It can be seen as the capacity, hope, and faith to withstand major trauma and loss, overcome adversity, and to prevail, usually with increased resources, competence, and connectedness. The individual's the integral unit of the family, and the family is the integral unit of the community and is responsible for community change and healing at an organic level. So resilience is dependent upon the health and resilience of all the individuals and families in the community, and that builds the community as a whole. So we want to build on the strength of the community to support resilience, and LINK is based on the philosophy of Ubuntu. So we build on that resilience and their resources and the extended natural support system. Are you all familiar with the difference between natural and ancillary or professional support system? The natural support system being our extended system that we are in contact with on an everyday basis. And the professional, ancillary, or artificial support system are those people with whom we only connect if there are issues, problems. So drawing on the natural support system, professionals coach LINK community facilitators who work with what we call community links, members of the community, natural change agents, trained as community links to achieve community goals. It's a three-stage process where it starts with the community coming together to share their history, traditions, and current situation. They then select community links, who they help lead to establish clear goals and committed work groups to achieve their tasks. And when they're all functioning, the community takes over and sustains the process for the long term when the outside professionals withdraw. And we're going to go through some examples. I'm going to use one core example to take us through those three stages. And then at the end, I'll give you some additional examples. So let's look at community challenges or stresses. And you've done a lot of this in the last few seminars, which I hope most of you have been able to attend. So every event that occurs in our lives, whether it's celebratory or traumatic, can serve as a stressor. And what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to play with me for a bit. I'd like you to add up the number of transitions you and your close circle of family and friends have experienced in recent time, say approximately 3 to 6 months. For some of you, recent time with a very key event like the loss of a patriarch or a major disaster might be longer. So this is very individual. You decide what's recent for you. And put your number in the chat. And close your eyes if it helps. Give you a moment. Okay, now think about how many more are happening in your community. So what I want to share with you is I've done this particular graph in probably over 100 countries, and they always look the same. So during the time that there are no major transitional crises, no community crisis, we have a peak at around three major transitions in a recent period of time. And then we have some other little sub-peaks. We find that people working in the community as change agents, whether it's professional or paraprofessional, tend to peak closer to 5. So always a couple above the general population. During or immediately after community crisis, we get a peak around 11 for the general population and 13 to 15 in an acute crisis with paraprofessionals. So now what I'd like you to do is to select any one of the transitions that you've added in your count, and think about the number of tasks that you've had to add to your responsibilities as a result of that one transition, and put that number in the chat, please. Okay, so let's take a look at, this is an amalgam of a lot of the graphs that I've done. The number of tasks tends to peak around 7, which is where I'm seeing, just looking roughly at yours, you're peaking on an average of 7, very much like other communities. And what I'd like you to do now is to think of that task number and multiply it by the number of transitions you listed. And that's the stress level. And then imagine what the community is dealing with. I think this really helps us. This took me many years and allowed me to understand why we see a 30% increase in onset or relapse of major issues, because every trauma currently facing us results in an increase of personal and family trauma. This multiplies exponentially when one's dealing with a community. The availability of resources is critical to maintain balance in the presence of stresses. So imagine the family who's lost their home and who have no supports, no money, no food, no extended family, no rescue mission, versus the one who has what they need to deal with the crisis. So that balance is critical to help with each of those tasks. Something as simple as a woman suffering from severe depression who has a sister in the neighborhood who can take care of her kids versus the one who can't. So our coping mechanisms are challenged when our resources don't balance with the stresses. And that results in a 30% minimum increase in problems. Like a low-grade temperature, stress can be measured. And the greater the stress, the higher the percentage of behavioral and physical health issues. For example, after Katrina, we saw not a 30% increase of substance use disorder, but a 70% increase in substance use disorder, for all the reasons that I'm sure you're all familiar with: the loss of family, loss of home, disconnectedness. So where we are right now is the perfect storm. All of these factors threaten the fabric of families. And if families are at risk, communities are at risk. And linked community resilience is one of the ways to help access the community and help them use their resilience, as are the other methods that you've heard so far, and the next ones that we'll be dealing specifically with community as well. And I'd like to hand back to Bob right now.
Let's take a very brief resilience pause, and let's continue to practice mindful breathing. Just breathe in and allow your abdomen to expand. Breathe out and just watch the breath leaving your body. And just practice watching yourself breathe without trying to change anything, without any judgments, without any right way or wrong way to breathe. Just breathe for a few moments. And you've all just thought about the number of stresses and transitions going on in your life. And just consider, as you continue the mindful breathing, what strengths do you bring to responding to those stressors? What strengths have you found in yourself that you might not have known existed before? What strengths did you tap into that you knew existed? And just become aware of how you've utilized your strengths, and we'll practice mindful breathing for just a few more seconds. Becoming aware of and tapping into our strengths is really vital in these kinds of difficult situations. And we'll hear more from Judith about how to respond to that. Judith? It's all yours. Go ahead.
Bob. Yes, so there was a question about what are transitions in our chat. And before we, as part of moving on to the actual process, it's good for us all to have the same definition. A transition is any kind of change in our lives. It can be a family life cycle, an individual developmental stage like leaving home or losing a parent. It can be moving house, which on the Holmes and Ray scale is the #1 stressor. So think about loss and trauma as major stresses, but even celebrations can be a major stress. While a young person's celebrating going off to college, parents might be grieving the loss of the child in the home, or it might be reminding them of the loss of another child. And the transitions that our family lived through reverberate through generations. They don't just stay in one generation. And there was a beautiful explanation in one of the earlier seminars about ACEs, about the trauma to children. And I just want as we're talking about families in the community, to stress that if a child is experiencing trauma, we know that that counts on the ACE inventory, but ACEs in parents and grandparents also get transmitted down the generations. So be aware that as we look at the community, we're looking at an amalgam of all of these individuals, their families, and all of their intergenerational stories. And I've included a TED talk of mine in your resources that goes through some of that in a lot more detail. So for the process of link, I'd like to take you through the story of Argentina. My first contact was from, I guess you'd call him the equivalent of our drug czar, who had been talking to the Minister of Health and Economy about the disaster across Argentina after the disappeared and the political and economic upheaval. So they were talking about how they could possibly start working with the communities to prevent the huge increase in substance use disorder, violence, domestic violence, and HIV/AIDS. And so the reason I've highlighted Buenos Aires province. We worked across the whole country, but Buenos Aires province was with 12 million people was where we did the evaluation. So stage 1 of link, community comes together. So I had to start working with the drug czar to form a planning group. And you've heard about various other methods and how they start their work. So we had to work out how to gain entry and access to the community through the initial contact, with representation of key community members and stakeholders, to form a planning group that would sunset once the process was underway, and then set up our planning group meeting. So this is the pyramid of prevention and intervention planning that I used with the drug czar to determine who to invite and to invite them. So Argentina is a hierarchical society. So in this particular situation, I have the peak of the pyramid at the top, because we had to make sure to include change agents from there. In some communities, you'll find that the first, Danny, that the first contact, sorry, I think my dog's hiking group has just arrived and she's excited. In some communities, you'll find that the base of the pyramid is on top, because your invitation's coming from a group within the bulk of the community. Good. Glad Danny didn't see him. She'd be howling with joy. We have to ensure that we have knowledge, authority, and understanding of the mission, that we're including change makers, that we're absolutely sure that we have special skills, leadership, and a full understanding of the context of the neighborhood, and that the people in our planning group are going to be able to mobilize motivation, support, an invitation, and permission to enter and work in that community. So that here's the list of the planning group. I'll just highlight a couple. The ministers were key because they would give us permission and access in this hierarchical society. We also included a couple of university faculty members, and the Fulbright Commission was already included to help provide funding, and as were the ministers. And the university faculty members were able to work with me through this whole process to develop initially an associate's degree, then a bachelor, and ultimately a master's degree for certified, basically a master's degree in link community resilience. So that we were helping not only training the links, but also providing them with a career path. So then we go on to the planning group meeting, where they then in turn use the pyramid to identify potential link community resilience facilitators. And those are really key. Those were people working for various social agencies, for all of the people on the planning group, and who would be the facilitators of the links in the community. Would then begin a new career path for themselves. So we're also providing training for people in the community, paraprofessionals and professionals. The planning group then designed a collaborative process of invitation to community members to attend a community meeting that can be anywhere from 1 to 3 days. So back to the pyramid with the planning group to see who needs to be invited, and making sure that there were people from every level, including professionals, people of all ages, people of every walk of life. And one of the other methods and tools we use, or maps, to make sure that we're inviting everybody in the community. Bob talked about the levels of society, the levels of a community. So we're looking at the individuals, their psychosocial system, the family, their families, an extended family, and all of that is our natural support system. And also being aware of their responses at each of these levels. Then we move up, we have the ancillary or artificial support system that in a society that's functioning well without trauma, hope we get there one day to that utopia, that almost shouldn't exist. And our work for those of us who are members of that system should sunset, and we should become part of prevention, which is really part of the natural support system. And that's embedded in cultural systems, evolutionary ecosystems. And this was just after, when I first drew this, it was just after the first landing on the moon. So galactic formations and beyond, and we now have people wandering out there. So think about this as your whole society. And then I want to answer a question in the chat about what is a transition. A transition is a change at any level. So I mentioned family, family and individual life spiral, but think about any change at any of these levels would be a transition, positive or traumatic. And we have to ensure with our planning group that all of those levels are included. So we're now moving to a large community meeting that will break into smaller groups, but that includes, I sometimes think of it as we have to make sure that we have a piece of the pie that involves every single level. So now we're ready. We're still in stage 1, part 3, the community resilience lecture. And we might start it just as you did with me now, and very much the way that I did with Argentina. We started with the transitions and task exercises, and then asking them who in their pyramid and transitional field map should be included, because they are going to go from this lecture to bringing in more members of the community, so that we slowly involve the entire community through this piece of the pie that we've invited to the community meeting. We then give them a little theoretical background to provide the logic of why we do what we do, because motivation is specifically attached to understanding the why. During the prevention of HIV/AIDS, we did a lot of research looking at what helps people change. And content is much less important than understanding process and why we need to bring about change. So everybody attends that community meeting, including our LINC community resilience facilitators, because this is where they start to learn the whole process themselves, to apply it in their own communities. And the first part is didactic and experiential with some background theory about LINC community resilience. And we go through some of the tools as we have with you. The second part is the communities breaking into small experiential groups, each with one of the LINC facilitators. The third part, they return to the larger group for a summary of their action plans. So some of the theory that I shared with them in Argentina and that we share in all of these meetings is our firm belief that all individuals, families, and communities are perpetually in transition and are inherently resilient and competent. Family resilience occurs when support systems and resources match levels of stress, as we discussed, and family and community links can be coached to serve as natural change agents to their own families and communities. We don't have enough professionals to serve everybody. We can't do therapy or social support to everyone in all communities. And training natural change agents as links between the professional and community system is enormously cost effective. Connectedness to family and culture of origin enables people to identify and utilize not only their community resilience, but their intergenerational competence. We help them understand the survival skills rather than being overwhelmed by stories of trauma, because the people who've survived are the ones who are living today. The families that didn't have that inherent resilience didn't make it. All of us in this world today have that inherent intergenerational resilience, no matter what horrors we've been through. So we assess the multiple levels and factors and challenges facing them, and we explore each level of the transitional field map. I'm not going to go through all this because you have the slide. We do genograms, the family professional's way of diagramming a family tree, the life spiral, which is a way of looking at the life cycle, the field map we've talked about, and various other maps that we use. And at this point, we use the transitional field map with everybody. So in that meeting in Argentina, we had cooks, street cleaners, adolescents, grandparents, doctors, government officials, and everybody in between. In each community, there were different numbers. One community, I had one of the greatest anxiety moments of my life, because we had driven to Mar del Plata, and there were tour buses there, and I hadn't realized that they'd been so successful in inviting their meeting that there were thousands of people. Fortunately, I had a large number of facilitators, and I was reminded by my guides to leave my ego at home and take my spirit and mission to work. And I was able to get in there and handle it, knowing I was not alone. I had all of the facilitators and an entire community only wanting healing and love and connection. So one of the maps that is really a core of the work we do, whether it's Arise with individuals, Life with groups, and so on, in a community, what's really critical is helping them understand their hypothetical transitional pathway, that path that takes us from the past with all its despair and trauma to the wisdom and understanding of the present, where we can choose to continue the vulnerability and the pain and the trauma, or we can choose to go forward with the resilience and the strengths and resources that have been accumulated along the way. And that can take us into the future with resilience and hope. And one of the ways that we use the transitional pathway is by developing a generic community resilience message that's the concept central to their internalizing their own resilience and healing. So this is the generic one that we shared in Argentina and with many other communities. Our community's been through very challenging times across many generations. We've survived a great deal and developed amazing strengths to apply to our current situation. It's time for all of us to heal and recover so that future generations do not have to suffer as we and our ancestors have. There's hope for the future. The research that we did with this shows that this is really the tipping point of the link intervention. That sudden awareness that removes shame, blame, and guilt and brings understanding and access to resilience. So I'd like you all to play with it. We're going to give you 7 minutes to develop your own small group community resilience message. And I will leave the components of it up on the screen for you while you do that. Small groups, please, Keisha. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had some fun with that. And if you'd like to post any of them in the chat, that would be great, but absolutely no obligation. Okay, so after the didactic component, the community breaks into small work groups, and what you've just done would be one of the tasks they're given. They share their history, traditions, and current situation. They develop specific goals, and then what we do with those goals is we have them break I know how to put this. They choose the easiest of the goals to achieve. And once they have that easiest goal, then we ask them to divide it into tasks so that they get used to how they're going to be working in their smaller groups with the leadership of the facilitators. And they then select work groups from their own communities so that the small groups are done geographically by the region that they're in so that they can start developing work groups from those. And then they do a selection process to find the best natural change agent to serve as their community link, who will be reporting to the link facilitator. The link facilitators, as you'll remember, will be attending those groups until the links are comfortable chairing or facilitating them themselves. And one of the things that we have a fairly elaborate process to select the best link. And one of the things we learned the hard way was that we always have the volunteer, the noisy one. I know this community best. I know everybody loves me. I will be the link. And that's usually the person you have to avoid, because usually that person with the loudest voice is a spurious link, somebody who has very clear ideas of what this community needs to do and is going to make sure they do exactly what they want. The challenge here is helping your facilitator learn to select a link who is not trapped at any pole of any major decision or direction, but is able to remain neutral and understand the group's needs. And that's one of the things we do in our training course. It's one of the other key pieces is choosing the right links. So once they've done that, they return to the main group and they present their members with, depending on how many days we have, if it's a short meeting or we've got a 3-day meeting, I like best having the members present themselves, their intergenerational family, and their community, along with their goals and plans. Because growing up in Africa, introductions are, and I know with First Nation and most Indigenous populations, the introduction is not who you are as an individual, but who are you? Where do you come from? What's your context? Who do you belong to? Who do you identify with? So that piece in the introductions and presentation is really helpful. Okay, we're moving on to stage 2. So the big meeting's done. Stage 2 is making sure, so now it's the link community facilitators with their groups. And we as professionals are going to be basically supervising, supporting them in their job. So the primary job of stage 2 is making sure that the links who've been selected are working well, able to establish goals and work groups. If they're not, they need to change. And the community will absolutely be part of making that change. So they're now meeting in their own local places, own communities, typically weekly. The facilitators attend until the community link has shown that they are able to coordinate and facilitate. And typically, by the way, the facilitators is a paid position as they move through their career. Typically, the community links receive small stipends and an allowance to cover things like snacks, drinks, bus fare, babysitting, whatever it is that that particular group needs. Because there are always challenges for community members, especially during times of crisis, to get to a meeting. Sometimes they'll meet in one home and then the next and rotate. But we make sure that they are doing what is going to make them as successful as they possibly can be. And then we move on to stage 3. The community takes over. Sorry, I'm just, when I look to the side, I'm checking my chat to make sure that I'm not missing an important question. I love your comments, by the way, thank you. So, community takes over. This is the time of joy for me. Once the meetings are functioning well under the guidance of the Link Community Resilience Facilitator, the outside professionals withdraw, but remain available as needed and may return if necessary for 1 or 2 community meetings. This differed all over Argentina, and all of our projects are different. We're relying on our facilitator to see that the meetings are effective and that the link is really comfortable. So typically it's 3 to 6 months. I've had one situation where with a nuclear disaster in Japan, which I was supervising at long distance, I didn't even attend the meetings. They wanted me to stay involved, available for meetings for about 8 months, which was much longer than usual, but they were doing beautifully on their own. We also, if necessary, continue to provide additional materials and make sure that they're getting the financial support that they need. Typically, the community resources take over and the endeavor continues on a volunteer basis. When a community has really been devastated, Taiwan, they had earthquakes and floods at the same time in areas of the country that had minimal resources to start with. And they ended up having we ended up developing a nationwide community resilience center that had to continue for years to help with depression, suicide prevention, and so on. And because there was nothing out in the areas that were devastated. The involvement of outside professionals with or without intermittent follow-up may be just stage 1 and the meeting, or it could be as long as several months. Argentina, the average was 6 months. And I went back at the 6-month mark and said goodbye to all the groups, but I still pop back at times. So let me just share the results of that one with you, seeing you've traveled through it with me now. As I mentioned, it was our evaluation was just Buenos Aires province, and the result was within 2 years, and this is just a couple of the results, within 2 years, there was a 400% increase in young people with substance use disorder being brought into treatment by their families. And follow up 15 years later in a city of 2 million people, 37 of 43 projects were still functioning. And around the country, they averaged somewhere around between 88 and 92% of the projects continuing at 15 years. And by the way, the mayor of the city of 2 million people had only been in office for 4 years, and he took total credit for change. He had no idea that we'd ever been there, which is exactly what we want. We tread lightly and leave no footprints. And they're currently doing a 25-year follow-up. So let's share some of the other examples, because I'd like to leave a little time for questions in the chat as well. So New York before and after September 11, my team and I were called in the day after 9/11 to help with use link in Lower Manhattan. And the reason I'm sharing this one is because I want to show you the transitional field map that they filled in. So this is what it looks like when a community group, and clearly we don't do this in the larger community meeting. This is done in the small groups. So this was one of the small groups. Not if you want me to take you through it a little bit. You do have it in your slides. So just notice that they filled in, even at the psychosocial level, they filled in their emotional reactions, what they were feeling, how their roles were changing, who they'd been cut off from. We also use this transitional field map to put the people, the actual names of the people. So in a small group, they can put the names of all the people they're inviting, name and role. So Juan, chef, would be in support system level, and so on. In some communities, we'll notice that there is a huge number in the ancillary or artificial support system. And one of the interesting little pieces of research we did was we wanted to know how many members of that artificial or ancillary support system it takes to replace one member of the natural support system or family. And family always is blood family, chosen family, who is important to the people we're talking with. And pop your number that you guess in the chat, please. How many do you think it takes? I'll give you a second to do that. How many members of us, the artificial or ancillary support system, does it take to replace one family member or member of the natural support system? 5. Some of you have hit that right on. 5 of us for one of them. So if we think of the communities in need, without resources, how powerful it is if we can mobilize them to do the work, train the links, so that we are right out there. And I want to share an example of a country where we did that. This was, I was called to Kosovo during, and obviously worked there after the war. The country was devastated. There were 37 professionals left of all kinds, teachers, doctors, psychologists, social worker, whoever, only 37 in the whole country. All of them and their families had been refugees. So they had to rebuild the whole country from the ground up. So they needed links. And their main task was improving professional services and treatment, compliance of treatment. They had a huge problem with severely mentally ill, reducing rates of addiction, developing health and mental health services and addiction services from the ground up, and working with lay members of the community. What they did was absolutely amazing. They established regional decentralized home health houses and treatment clinics. And what we decided, so there were 7 regions, so there were multiple home health houses in all of the 7 regions and 7 treatment clinics. Nobody was allowed to go to a health house that was run by paraprofessionals. Sometimes there was a social worker there if there was one available, or a traveling psychologist. Nobody was allowed to, no patient, no person was allowed to go to the health house without a member of their support system. So we were already building in that community connection. And only if that health house couldn't help did they go to a clinic, and only if that didn't help did they go to the central city for the for a specialized hospital. And they mobilized family and community links to reach out to families in every region, ensuring collaboration across all the services and the families. And just one of the results was that individuals suffering from schizophrenia had a 98% compliance rate of attending treatment and taking the medication, which is unheard of. The 2% that didn't, 1% was because of roadblocks, because the roads were in such bad shape, or roadblocks, by the military. Another more recent example was Aurora, Colorado. You'll remember there had been a school shooting there, and then the more recent one was the theater shooting, cinema theater shooting. Aurora, interestingly, is a microcosm of the United States culturally, society-wise. And I counted at one of the community meetings, there were 29 different countries represented. So think of all the languages and cultures. And all the way through, when we think about that pie out of the transitional field map, a complete representation of society. There had been enormous gun violence and a lot of other violence, a huge increase in substance use disorder and mental health challenges. Their work, as a result of their working through LINK, established Community Resilience Center that serves as an ongoing resource to the community today. Our current projects, we're currently being invited to work in a number of different parts of Appalachia where there's an increase in substance use disorder, behavior and mental health needs, and very few resources. There are areas, for example, in the Holler in Kentucky, where they don't have law enforcement or a fire brigade. And for those of you who are interested in Appalachia, there was an amazing movie that's on the circuit, if you want to find it, called Kentucky Burning, that really gives one a sense of what those families and community are dealing with. And then there was a more recent one from a book about a man who grew up in Appalachia and his story. And I wish I could remember. Anybody who saw the movie or read the book, please pop it into the chat. And we've also done, oh, thank you, Hillbilly Elegy. Thanks, Becky. I was blocking, I have long COVID and my memory for names is not there right now. Very grateful to you, Becky. We also have done some work in Alaska in the past, up in Barrow, the northernmost city, where they go from one extreme to the other. The Inupiat rely for survival on their allotment of whales, and then they switch to caribou season and whales, and then they switch to caribou and then polar bears. All of those populations of food are diminishing because of climate change. And the Inupiat population is struggling desperately. We've also just been asked to work in Manilak, where there are already 4 villages that no longer have housing because of the melt, and the houses are built on pylons, and of course, they're no longer there. In Barrow, we were dealing with the rapid cultural transition, with suddenly the money from oil was pouring in, but intermittently, huge increase in addiction, and then the money would be gone again. We had the amazing privilege of having one of their most famous groups come in and do a potlatch, and just watching the intergenerational and tribal history unfold through dance and song, and watching the little ones join and learn was one of the most moving experiences of my life. Watching the transitional pathway in action. So Alaska, we're beginning to see all of the things that we expect from major stress and climate change. So, what we're dealing with now around the world is that there's a huge gap between need and workforce. And this is not just here in the United States, it's all over the world. And one of the things that I think we all need to be doing is helping funders understand that just doing training of people is critical, but then they have to be matched with the money that's going into the places where the projects are developing, because we can't have that separation. And I think this whole seminar series is built as that bridge between the need and the workforce. And I hope that Link is one of the contributors to that. And I think one of the most key pieces for me is remembering that if trauma can be passed down through generations, so can healing and resilience. And we've used this model in many countries and cultures with varying situations, ranging from human-made to natural disasters, systemic oppression and racism, poverty, lack of resources, to migrant and refugee populations. It's a universal process. Families and communities are universal. So is their resilience. It's inherent in our human condition to move from trauma to resilience. Bringing connection and hope is the only pathway to survival. Thank you. I'd like to open to chat, or Bob and Keisha, Megan, if you've seen anything that I need to be answering, please let me know. Otherwise, this might be
Bob, let me just.
This might be a good time, Bob, for you also to do a resilience pause, which I can pull up for you if you like.
That's all right. Let me wait for just a second and ask everybody to put any questions you have in chat. And as you do that, why don't we take just a second, practice a little more mindful breathing. Just watch your breath in and out without judgment, without trying to change anything. And as you do that, just notice what questions come up for you, or what is it that draws you the most to what you've heard so far. And if specific questions emerge, or specific issues or topics seem most present to you, continue to practice mindful breathing throughout the rest of the session if you'd like, but share what's coming up for you or what questions you have or key points you might have in chat. And then Judith can respond. Judith, I'll start with just one question for you. What, with this approach, which is just really wonderful, can you give one or two suggestions for how the participants here, the 40 people that are involved, can begin to engage in this kind of work? What would be the first couple of steps they could take in their communities or to get started? You're on.
I thought I'd unmuted.
There we go.
Yeah, the easiest way to start is to think about who your connections are and just follow the protocol. You know, it's you've actually got the entire thing listed on those slides. And when we do a training, what I've used with you is just an abbreviated form of exactly what we do in every community. And starting with your first contact, and thank you, Bob, for the question. Start with your first contact. Who thinks, you know, who do you think is aware of the need? Is it you? Are you the person who needs to be that first contact? Do you need for your planning group to bring in people who are closer to the issue or who have a little more objectivity, or both and? Use the pyramid as you think about where you need to be. How does your community look? Is it hierarchical? Is it much more community organized? How are you going to bring both together? And make sure with your planning group that you're able to motivate people with a cause that is going to be resounding through that whole pyramid. Or do there need to be multiple causes? I would love to see some of the challenges that you're experiencing in your community right now on our chat. Because I'm sure as I've been talking, you're thinking about those. So if each of you puts down one, we'll have an amazing community list. And I'm not obligating all of you to put down one. Schools need resilience. So starting with people in a school, who in the local school, are your kids at school? Do you know somebody whose kids are at school who can introduce you? Safety in one's mind, one's chosen family, one's community, and one's systems is a prerequisite. So choosing safety as an issue, who in your community could you invite who would be appropriate for a planning committee to deal with safety? You know, I lived in inner city Philadelphia when I taught at Penn, and then inner city Rochester when I taught in Rochester. And my heart nearly broke. My executive director of our department came to me one day in tears and said she'd just spoken with her son who was graduating from high school and asked for this enormous party. And she said, "What, you know, why do you want this big party? You're only going to be 18. That's for when you turn 21. And he said, "Mom, how many of us are alive at 21? I want to celebrate now." Safety is huge in so many communities. This is an amazing list. Someone wants to focus on youth and mental well-being. Go through the schools, through the colleges. Unemployment. Who do you need to involve? Starting with, sorry, I saw an arm up stretching. Are you asking a question, Christina? No, okay. Community climate awareness. These are amazing. Self-value and community value being realized. Any of these, inequity with the in-home learning is huge. we actually have a group started in our community where the teachers are rotating who calls, especially the little ones who, and the adolescents, the young adolescents who are just starting to socialize. One of the teachers is calling each of those kids. So each kid, well, a kid will get a call once a month as they rotate through, but it'll be a personal call from a teacher maintaining those connections. You know, pulling together a community, a planning group to talk about how we're going to educate the families in the area about how to survive COVID or how to plan for climate change, how to build, the food insecurity. And I mean, this is absolutely incredible. Clergy and communities of faith. We had a number of faith leaders and spiritual leaders on that. I think we had 3 or 4 of them on that planning group. They're key because they have already established communities that they can access easily. This is just so exciting. You're all thinking in concrete terms. Community mental health, so raising awareness in the charity to take responsible steps. Environmental friendliness, which a lot of people think, and I won't say much more about how they're thinking it, but a number of people think it's irrelevant. It's not going to happen to them. And they don't know that by, the year 2040, we already have 25 million refugees. And by the year 2040, we'll have another 20 million refugees just from climate change. So we should be preparing for the movement of people across the world. I was working with a think tank in Vienna to plan for the Berlin Wall to come down and what would happen when all of the refugees across, started moving across Europe. And just working with, we had, various, we had an economic minister from Switzerland. I was their token mental health person. And, there were various mayors and community leaders and so on. And I remember the Swiss economy minister saying, we're not having any refugees. We don't want our standard of living to be changed. And there was a mayor from a tiny little alpine town in Austria. And he said, he'd gone, and this was an ongoing meeting, he'd gone to his community to say, can we take refugees when they come? And they'd said, no, we're too small, we can't do it. And he said, wait a minute, we're a ski town. Our numbers double in ski season. What do you mean we don't have room? And by the time the refugees came, they had learned some of the cooking and the clothing, and they met them on the bridge and welcomed them into their homes. And a lot of them stayed years after. But it's really so much changing attitude. And that's what your planning group, when they're looking at numbers for representation, it's also, and this is coming through so clearly in the chat, we're also looking for representation of different ways of thinking, whether we agree with them or not. Because if we don't include the ones we don't agree with as well as the ones we do, we're going to be cutting out a part of the community that will rise up and destroy whatever we're building. And that's, I've been around an awfully long time, and I still struggle with that one. I hate having the naysayers and the bigots in my groups, but I know I have to, and it's painful. Wow. Yeah, I love this with milestones, safety and wellness, increase social resilience. And thank you for doing the evaluation for Bob that he's put in the chat. And thank you all for being here today. I hope to hear from you. You have our contact information on the chat. And I've really enjoyed being with you. And sorry I couldn't hear your voices, and you've had to listen to so much of mine.
Judith, we want to thank you for the wonderful presentation. And you do have contact information for Judith if you'd like to reach out to her and her staff. Or if you want to contact us, we can put you in contact with her if that's a problem. Judith's slides will be posted on the website soon, and she has resources in there. So just you'll be able to get those. Also, again, I want to ask you, just as Judith was saying, to please complete the evaluation that you'll find in chat. But also, if you want the CE credits, to remember to sign out. That's also found in chat. And the next session is going to be with Dr. Daniel Aldrich, who I've worked with, who is really focused on the social support networks. How do you build those social support networks? It builds right off of what Dr. Landau was just talking about. And he does a really good job at this across boundaries. And what we mean by that is across economic, cultural, and geographic boundaries in a community, which is really, really vital. And let me say one final thing that somebody mentioned, building community resilience for the climate crisis. Think of all the transitions, to use Judith's words, that we are all already going through and are not aware of, really. But will increasingly go through as the climate emergency worsens. Economic issues, food issues, water issues, migration in and migration out, and many other struggles that people and traumas and toxic stresses that people will experience. Unless we build community resilience for these and help people build on the strengths they have, tap into their resources, connect with natural links, that people will retreat into, as they already are, a fear-based, self-protective survival mode that will only exacerbate the many problems that we've already had, in addition to making it even more difficult to deal with the climate crisis. So this approach that you've just heard is really vital to not only helping with mental health and psychosocial well-being, but to enabling us to get a handle on and reduce the climate emergency to manageable levels. So with that, again, I want to thank you, Dr. Landau, for your wonderful presentation. And we look forward to seeing you all again next week for the next presentation next Tuesday. Thank you all and have a good week. Take care.